When it came to buildings in Crusader Kings, there were many options, but let's face it really only came down to two. Does it make money or does it buff my troops? But then in a patch, the mechanic advantage went from something effectively irrelevant but nice to have, a minnow 2% damage boost to every 1 advantage, to an insane 10%. Now it couldn't be ignored, and it was certainly ripe for abuse. Fortunately, the team reacted quickly enough to bring it to a reasonable 5%, well, if we chose the default anyway, which I think is the right amount. But what this has done is challenge my concept of the duality between buffs and money in buildings. For now, there is a third player. And you have to choose how you invest wisely. Now comparing wealth to battle prowess is going to be a bit like comparing apples to oranges, but buffs to advantage, they ultimately do the same thing, help you win battles. Now buffs are considered the strongest long term. As you go through the tech tree, you collect more and more while the AI struggles to judge the additional damage when deciding to engage. But a well planned advantage is also great, especially early game, and can be quickly set up with little investment. But many people find this hard to use as the enemy can be quite hard to goad, especially into a fight that looks to their disadvantage. I mean, how is it you can convince someone to attack you so you get the defensive bonus? Well, this is the key. If the enemy army is in a barony which contains a castle under your control, whether it is part of your domain or recently conquered, you will always get the defensive advantage from both terrain and buildings, regardless of the fact you are moving into that barony. And the AI, if you avoid open battle, they will typically start sieging down your castles, and that's when you swoop in. In fact, you can cheese it by plonking your capital in an advantageous terrain, fortify like mad, and bait them over with the chance of capturing your heir only to smash them. Now, through testing, it seems that if you move into a barony they are sieging, they don't even get the defending from a river bonus crossing either. You will get the penalty from coming off boats, however, and there will be other standard penalties. And also, because I checked, you don't get the advantage bonus if you have lay clergy and are moving into a barony that has a temple building you hold. So let's roleplay a scenario, albeit a heavily constrained one. Here we are as the Count of Tripoli, and our neighbours are belligerent and we want to secure our one county position. Here is your army, you have space to station and 1 men-at-arms. What military building should we build to optimise our chances in a defensive war? So what we have is another terrible Python script which can calculate how many levies you can dispatch, and we'll put that on the y-axis. And for the x-axis we'll place every level of building. Every building goes from 1 to 8 for some reason, which makes it easy to plot from worst to best, and will allow us to see how the performance changes as the buildings become more advanced. And of course, if you're stationing men-at-arms, the castle and each level of it will provide a minimal bonus, and you need to increment the castle to advance through the building chains. So for now, let's plot how the army does with just the Mubarizm stationed with bonuses from the castle. So, where were we? Oh yes, what building chain do you pick? So if you said hunting grounds, you'd be wrong, as the barracks does a far better job of squeezing out potential from your Mubarizm. So if you said barracks, you'd still be wrong, because the correct answer is, of course, the watchtower. And if you include the rest of the army, this is even more pronounced. And if you include the rest of the army on drylands, well, hunting grounds is now better than barracks as well. Now you are the Count of Cornwall, and this is your army. But with a few archers to your name, what could be a wise investment here? Hunting grounds maybe this time? Militia camps, also a good idea. But outposts are head and shoulders above the rest. And likewise before, if we're including the rest of the army, the benefits of having advantage and even being in a bonus terrain are getting more obvious, with militia camps dropping now to third. So an ideal situation, going off our winners, is that you actually want a bit of both. If we take a standard men-at-arms and we plot the advantage on the x-axis, and buffs on the y-axis, and damage on the z-axis, we can see just about a little bump. Optimal performance. As looking at the sides, I want to point out that there isn't a direct relationship between buffs and advantage, not to say that one advantage is equal to 5% buff in damage and toughness. Well, actually, in a specific context, we could. A quick bit of maths. Assuming just for 2 regiments fighting each other of the same unique type and omitting combat width for now, you can say that, for each turn, the enemy's losses because of your army will be the number of your troops times the amount of damage times 0.03 divided by the enemy's toughness. The percentage losses for the enemy is the same thing but divided by the number of their troops. And if you want to win a fight, or at least not lose, your losses need to at least match or be smaller than theirs. So we have the following equation, which we can now balance. We can also include advantage, though it is only possible for one side to have advantage enabled at one time. So in summary, the things we can improve on are damage, toughness, advantage, and numbers to the squared, which is why I have mentioned in the past that numbers are so important. But in reality, the combat width does somewhat offset this. Anyway, this means if you want to increase your damage by a factor of 2, it's the equivalent of increasing your toughness by 2 or advantage by 2. Also, doubling your toughness, damage and advantage is much easier to do than increasing either one of them 8-fold to achieve the same total damage. So in simple terms, one advantage is plus 5% damage or plus 5% toughness. But what's important is that damage and toughness often come together. So, for example, if you had plus 100% damage and toughness, you would need plus 300% advantage to match. A factor of 2 in both would need to be a factor of 4 in just advantage. And you would need to square the advantage just to match. And as we can see, most buildings provide both. So that seems answer then. Go for buffs? Well, no. The exact value of advantage compared to damage and toughness is more nuanced than that. And it will depend on the context you're playing in and what kind of armor you're using. To show this a little better, let's do this in 2 dimensions. We have the x-axis, where to the left hand side is the maximum investment in advantage, and to the right hand side is the maximum investment in buffs. Going from 40 advantage to 0, and from 0 to 100% increase in damage and toughness, going from left to right, making anywhere in between a mixed proportion of the two. Going with a firm favourite like crossbowmen, we can see that its optimal balance is where advantage is 12 and buffs are plus 70% in damage and toughness. Why? Well, this is around the point where the multiplier for advantage, toughness and damage are all about equal, alluding to that optimal point I discussed earlier. And this will be a useful starting point for showing how the values of buffs or advantage change in context. For example, if you brought some levies, they, most of the time anyway, don't receive any buffs, but they do take advantage of, well, advantage. With that, the optimal point has moved to the left, showing that each pointed advantage is now more valuable than before. Adding, say, 5 knights is the same thing, making it more valuable. In fact, advantage gets more valuable the more help you're bringing to the fight. Say if you're horribly outnumbered, so you decide to call in an ally and he doubles the size of your army. But that's still not enough, so you rope in some mercenaries or maybe a holy order if you have access to one. Well, in that case, advantage is far more valuable than buffs. In this very controlled scenario, the math suggests you are better off getting 40 points in advantage before bothering investing in any buffs in your crossbowmen. Essentially, each point in advantage is going to give you more damage, up to 40, which is wild. But not all wars are where you are up against the wall, but it's helpful to know that when you are dragging everyone along you know who can help, advantage is the one to depend on. But then again, you might not be able to get that much help. Another thing to consider is advantage and whether you may already have it or not. It's intuitive based off what we've seen before that if you already have, say, 20 advantage, each increment to the advantage you add on top is going to be less valuable than if you were starting from 0. The inverse is true if you're starting at a massive disadvantage. If, say, a conqueror comes along and he has an absolutely monstrous martial skill, every point of advantage becomes a lot more valuable. So it would seem it's more favourable to level the playing field than to boost your troops. And finally, the last thing to consider is terrain. This is because if you include terrain in the damage formula, it looks like this. It is your base damage multiplied by your buffs and the terrain bonus is added. Same for toughness, but advantage is applied afterwards, so any terrain bonuses will be amplified by advantage but buffs will not. This means if you use your unit in an advantageous terrain, advantage will become slightly more valuable. The opposite for disadvantageous terrain in that buffs do a better job of offsetting the disadvantage. This is probably shown best with a unit like Nile Archers, which gets a massive bonus and penalties being in floodplains and desert. Another way to show this is if we take a whole subset of men-at-arms, say like heavy infantry, and we can plot a chart to see how much advantage is needed to get the same damage as the bonus from being stationed in a barracks. It means the variance without a terrain bonus, you will need the most advantage to get the same performance for, say, the generic men-at-arms or Drazzini. But for units like Mountaineers or the Varangian Veterans, you just need a portion of that advantage to get the same amount of damage in good terrain. So, in summary, the more you rely on terrain, the more useful your advantage is to you. But this relationship with advantage and terrain brings me to something that bothers me. Are Monaspa any good? Because if you've seen the CK3 community, my god, they love Monaspa. And if you're playing defensively, this is fantastic. Defending your castle, your high damage cav, your advantage in terrain and your domain buildings, Manaspa can handle a lot, compared to the generic heavy cav or even cataphracts. But if you want to play aggressively, it's a bit more nuanced. If you want to take the fight to them and conquer their lands, if you're fighting in mountains, the advantage against you is still massive despite your terrain bonus. In fact, the disadvantage is so bad, your Manaspa performs better in the flat despite no terrain bonus. But crucially, if you would rather be taking the fight in the flat because they perform better, then you're better off using cataphracts or generic heavy cav anyway. Strategically, you should never take a fight in the mountains if it can be helped, making Manaspa primarily a defensive unit. If we add stationing buffs to all these different units, the cataphracts are even better off, closing the gap in performance in both mountainous terrain and doing even better in the flat. The only situation that has Manaspa performing even better when attacking in the mountains is if you bring up your advantage by a significant amount. To undo that, about -12. Though I will concede, when push comes to shove, if you're fighting in mountains, they will do a better job than most. Sorry, I may have tainted your opinion of Manaspa, but if you plan to annihilate first and siege later, I'd go with cataphracts. So finally, playstyles. The biggest boost, or at least the easiest ones to get, are from commanders, terrain and buildings, and the latter of those two are defensive. The best we can do with advantage aggressively is try and reduce the enemies as much as possible. Things like Fjorda, where you can cross rivers without a penalty, or Flexible Leader for reducing the negative effects. And probably most useful, army speed. Because if your army's fast, you can dictate where the battles take place. Ideally somewhere flat where you're chasing them down. Okay, so I'm just putting this bit in the end, but it turns out there is one example I could find of offensive advantage, and that is through a martial event. And essentially it just gives you a +5% bonus when attacking, so that's pretty cool. And that's pretty much it. Advantage versus buffs, both valuable, but for advantage I'd say it's more valuable in the early game, when using loads of levies, when most of your men-at-arms are siege, you like bringing mercenaries and allies, or you like to squeeze bonus damage from terrain. More useful when playing tall. And with buffs, much better late game, much more flexible and consistent, and you don't have to think as much, which is always nice. And that's it. The rest, well, that's up to you.